He's editor-in-chief of Breitbart News and a New York Times best-selling author. And on this podcast, he brings deep research, prescient analysis, and world-class guests. He's Alex Marlow, and this is The Alex Marlow Show.
Hi, everyone. I'm on the road in Washington, D.C. yet again, doing all sorts of business to help boost what we're doing at Breitbart, what we're doing with the show. Today, we got another deep dive conversation with Spencer Klavan. Spencer Klavan, you may recognize the name Klavan, Andrew Klavan's son. He's a really intellectual and a younger guy, an educator, and he's given a lot of deep thought to some of the things that I care about a lot. Like, for example, how we're getting less literate, even though we have so much access to information, and whether or not we're actually prepared for the AI revolution. He's really thinking about this, I think, in a sophisticated way, and you're going to like the way this guy thinks. I promise you that. He's really impressed me, and I was meaning to have one of these conversations with him, and here it is. This is me with Spencer Klavan. All right, new guest of the program, Spencer Klavan. He's the author of the book Light of the Mind, Light of the World. He's got a Substack with a familiar face to some of you, Andrew Klavan, The New Jerusalem. You guys can get that as well. He's the associate editor, Claremont Review of Books. And Spencer, I've known your dad for a long time, but I saw that you did a very cool panel on AI with Winton Hall, who's one of our top guys at Breitbart News, who's a pretty brilliant person. And I want to get into some of that, but I got to ask a little bit about just what's it like to have Andrew Klavan as a dad? Because everyone looks to him as a sage, a very wise man, someone who understands the classics, literature. That must have been interesting.
Well, first of all, I have to offer the disclaimer that there's actually no relation between myself and Andrew Klavan. I've never met the man.
Oh, that just
actually is something that we
amazing.
Yeah,
I bet
you
people seem to use that all the time.
Absolutely. We started it the first time I ever went on my dad's show. You know, he's got the podcast at Daily Wire, The Andrew Klavan Show, and I went on. And he just made that joke offhand because he thought I wouldn't want to be associated with an evil right-winger like himself. And it kind of stuck. And now I meet people all the time in the street. They're like, I'm so confused.
Yeah.
I genuinely do not understand what's going on. So it's just a joke. He is my dad. And yeah, he's like everybody's dad now, which is kind of a weird experience. I think one of the cool things about him is that what you see is what you get. He's not somebody that's playing a character on TV. He really, the kind of, I think, humane wisdom that he gives on the show, that was always there. And then, just the saturation with great literature is also something he really gave to me. I feel like I'm lucky that I not only love and admire my dad, as all sons sort of are primed to do, but I also consider my dad a friend. Like, I don't think everybody gets to be friends with their father, but we really, I think, share this love for the Western classics. And I was kind of encouraged to pull books down at random from the shelves when I was growing up. And it really felt like not only were my dad and I friends, but the great authors of the past were also friends. And that's something that has stuck with me, because now this idea that Western civilization is evil or oppressive, or it has some secret ulterior motive of repression, like, I was always kind of inoculated against that growing up, because I knew these authors so well, and I knew that they were such necessary companions, like in times of trouble, when you're confused, or when you're facing big questions like we are now as a society. And so I think this idea that, like, the West is somehow evil is something you can only really sustain if you, like, never actually crack a book. You know, it depends on and creates a situation in which people never actually go to the original texts. They just listen to somebody tell them, well, this, white oppressor author is racist. So that was
which is very bizarre, because we're in this age where everyone is skeptical of everything and all the time. Everyone is just feels like we have no idea who to trust, and yet we have books. They are real, and yet people would rather hear them summarized, I guess, rather than just taken out yourself.
Totally. I think something C.S. Lewis says, which I really love. He's kind of one of my intellectual heroes. He was a teacher, as I am, and he had discovered something which I've kind of taken into my classroom too, that, like, a lot of the times students will come in and they will want somebody to explain Plato to them. They'll want to read about the dialogues of Plato, or they'll want to read about Homer. And actually, there's a kind of modesty in it because they feel like the great writers must be too difficult for them to understand, so they need somebody. But in fact, Lewis says, part of the greatness of the greats is that they're more vivid, more clear, more commonsensical and straightforward than a lot of the other people that come along and write about them, especially now when so many of those people are trying to tell you why this is actually wrong and bad, and you should fault Shakespeare for his misogyny or whatever. If you actually spend time slowly and with care with some of these great works, you'll discover they're about real life, right? They're about what it means to be a human being, how to be good at being a human being. And those are concerns that we all share. And truly great writers are actually more clear, more accessible, more exciting than these explainers or these summaries or whatever that you might get. But it's sort of counterintuitive because you think they're these intimidating people that you can't access because they're so great, but it's actually they're great because they're talking to you about your life.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're so obviously we didn't have AI or Grok to translate stuff to us, 3 years ago, and we didn't have the internet 20, 30 years ago, or whatever it was. So it's people just had to read stuff themselves before. So I don't think we've gotten that much stupider in the last 30. Evolution can move quickly, but not that quickly. So we should theoretically be able to read.
This is something. In principle, we still have the ability. We have the technology, the brain capacity to read sentences on a page. But people are not doing it. I mean, there are terrifying studies about like 40% fewer people read for pleasure, and over the these are there's a lot of these that are coming out now, and it's interesting. On the one hand, of course, AI is this radically new technology. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. On the other hand, this is something that happens. It's even in the dialogues of Plato when people first start to use the written word, because before papyrus and before books, people would memorize stuff. They would have conversations, and then they would give things to memory. And one of the things that Socrates says in this dialogue, the Phaedrus, about writing is this looks like it's a memory aid. It looks like it's going to help us to know more, but actually it's going to make us worse at memorizing things, and we're going to know less because we're going to rely on the book. The book is going to have everything written down, and we won't think that we need to. And so then actually we will lose the ability that we hand off to the machine. And there is, I think, always that danger with this technology that you outsource some new thing, some human act, and then you think like, well, it's all out there somewhere, right? And you hear people say this, everything's on the internet. So the important thing is that we know where to find these great works, right? But actually, the more we store in databases, the more we kind of give off to machines, the more we kind of lose the knack and lose the habit. And I feel this happening with myself. Like, I have a terrible sense of direction because I grew up with
GPS,
Apple Maps. Exactly. So it's not that Plato wouldn't have wanted us never to write books. I mean, he himself wrote philosophical dialogues, and the point is not like reject the technology, never use it. It's just anything you get a machine to do for you, or a piece of an object to do for you, you're trading off your own ability. So the question is like, what are the abilities that we want our tech to take over for us? What are the things that we actually are happy to automate? And then what's the stuff that if we're not doing it, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if the AI has the full text of War and Peace somewhere. If you haven't gone through the process, the experience of reading it, it's about your direct engagement. Okay,
so you did an essay in the Free Press. I think this was about a month or so ago. And by the way, I'm told the Free Press is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So this must have been an unbelievable essay. I just learned that last week or two.
I didn't get a share in the publication.
Yeah, hey,
just for writing that piece.
You know what? But I mean, just doing the math, I'm just figure it's got to be worth at least a couple million, just based off of whatever Matt Paramount was doing. But so the title's What Happens If No One Reads, and it's a lot on what you've introduced just now, is that if AI is summarizing everything, then it's not, you don't just read just for information. There is more to it than that, but I want to hear it in your words. Why do we read? Why is it important to read books, read articles, etc.?
Well, this is something that is suddenly urgent and used to be the kind of thing that literary professors would wax poetic about, and everybody would be like, yeah, that's nice. But now, because AI is offering to take over so many of our daily tasks, we really have to think seriously, I think, about like what are the ones that we still want to do. And we have this culture, like influencer culture, if you like, or self-help culture, where you'll see people posting, these are the 100 books that I read this year, or this is my stack of books that I read one every day. And that's very tempting because it looks kind of efficient and it looks like, wow, that guy's really getting a lot done. But then you look at the titles in the stack, right? And it's like How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's the Rich Dad, Poor Dad kind of genre of book. And I have nothing against the information in those books. I've read a fair few of them, but they are kind of information delivery systems.
Yeah,
right?
they're life hacks. No,
Boxes.
and I read a lot of those books just because I'm in the industry, and I feel like you need to see things that sell just hundreds of thousands, not millions of copies. It's kind of fascinating to try to figure out what captivates people about them to that level. Yeah, but there are a lot of efficient delivery systems of things that will purportedly help your life if you follow them.
Exactly. And if you now look at why is it that AI is kind of cratering people's interest in reading? Why has this thing struck like a meteor and taken all of these people who used to go read books and now they just look for AI summaries? Well, I think those are the sorts of books, and that is the kind of reading that you really can outsource to AI.
Yeah.
Like if what you're getting out of the book is a series of bullet points effectively delivered in a polished way that you're then going to take away, right? Well, why not just get AI to do the bullet points for you? And that is what people are doing now, right? You see all these posts. Well, this is what I got. It would have taken me 5 hours to read this book, but I just asked AI to kind of tailor a summary to me. And I think, okay, if that's what you're doing with books, then that's probably what you'll do with AI. But there is another kind of reading, and when we talk about the glories of literature, the treasures of Western civilization, all this stuff that people kind of get teary about, right? We're actually not talking, we're talking about a totally different kind of thing than the How to Win Friends and Influence People or Rich Dad, Poor Dad type book.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that we're talking about is the Platonic dialogue, right? And when you think about what's a Platonic dialogue, well, it is a little conversation in amber, right? It's not a series of bullet points. In fact, if you try to summarize a Platonic dialogue, you'll often find, wait, I thought I understood this, but it's a lot more complicated than I thought, and I need to go back to the text, and I need to look again and see, well, does Socrates think the soul is immortal, or does he think it's not? And you have these profound questions that deal with our lived experience, to use a hackneyed phrase, right? Our experience of the world. The questions that never really have final answers because their answers are in life itself. And then you realize, okay, this book is basically like a new wing of my soul. Like it's a whole new world of experience, a whole new set of thoughts for me to grapple with, maybe for my whole life. And the great books are all like that. I mean, War and Peace, the Brothers Karamazov, these big novels, these sort of daunting novels. Why is it that there's so much of them, that they're so big, that they're so kind of full of all these characters? Well, because they're trying to open up new corners in your soul. And I think it's really important to keep the value of that, even as AI does all this other stuff, because that is the thing that is irreplaceable about us, right? Our machines can do all sorts of things. They can automate all kinds of calculation, and probably they'll do yet greater things to come. But the one thing they will never do, because they aren't human, is they won't have an encounter between a living soul and the created world. That's, in a nutshell, that's what we've always been. We are souls in bodies. We are these animals that have this contact with the divine. And that's what literature is supposed to do. And if you outsource that to AI, then you're really toast, I think.
So AI is pretty recent. I do want to turn to AI in a second here, but I was thinking about it. Are there any great millennial novelists? I'm not sure. I think you're a little younger than I am, Spencer, but I'm close to 40. And I don't think I've ever read, I don't know if I've read a novel by a millennial, and I certainly haven't heard of any of them being great. But that said, if it's great, it doesn't mean it would get attention. I don't read a ton of novels, and certainly no one under 60. I don't think, but maybe that's just a blind spot for me. But are there any great millennial novelists who are out there, and I just don't know they are?
That's a great question. I think I could probably talk about this question for a long time, but I'll try to keep it brief. So I think I'm kind of millennial core. I'm 30. I always forget how old I am. I'm 34. Mm-hmm. And so I'm right in the middle of that millennial generation. Yeah. I do read a lot of contemporary novels, not because I think they're great necessarily, but because I do think it's interesting to see what people are getting up to. I don't know if Bret Easton Ellis counts.
He doesn't. No. And Bret and I are.
No. Okay.
So we're friendly. When I had fewer kids, I used to spend time with him, and he's an amazing person. And he, but he's 60 years old, I think. So.
Okay. Well, there's a couple things about this. One is that art forms, like people, do have lifespans, life cycles, and they go through periods of kind of the peak apex, like when you're in your prime. And I think the novel's prime was probably the 19th and 20th centuries. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is that the novel is about a social world. It's kind of about the social life of a particular culture or nation. And we're going through a time when that's really disintegrating in a lot of the nations of Europe. And so it's harder maybe to write a great novel that really captures something that isn't so much there anymore. The other thing is that when you ask, why are all the greats kind of these old-fashioned, novels from the past or paintings from the past? Why is there's this antiquarian thing? Well, it actually takes time for this stuff to become clear. And sometimes is several generations before we realize who was the great novelist. I'm thinking actually of Shakespeare, who in his day was, not a novelist, but a playwright, but he was kind of one among a number of great playwrights working in the Elizabethan and Jacobean age. Christopher Marlowe was arguably more famous. There are others who kind of, if you ask, well, who are the big guys, And it was really in the subsequent generations and guys like Dr. Johnson, the famous critic, who kind of discovered Shakespeare in a way. It's funny to think about a time when Shakespeare had to be discovered, but he did. And, Kafka, Virgil, these are all people who kind of Keats died feeling like they hadn't really achieved what they wanted to.
Wow.
And so you need the time to kind of winnow it out. So there may be great millennial novelists working. I don't know anyone that I would call great now, but I think it takes time to discover these things.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I want to tie in some of these themes here. So this is really the essence of what I wanted to talk to you about is in your book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which I've perused. I mentioned this before. I like to do a real deep dive in the book, so I like to announce to the audience, I've read this thing, and here's what I'm taking away from it. Here's the conversation. But from what I was able to glean, this is super important. You look at scientific discoveries, and you have a really important insight that you see God in them. You think a lot of them lead us back to God. I fundamentally agree with you on this, but you've obviously given a little deeper thought than I have, and I want to hear you describe it to people.
Yeah, well, I really love this quote, and it's often attributed to Werner Heisenberg, who's one of the great fathers of quantum physics. He never said it quite this way, but the point is, the first sip from the cup of science will make you an atheist. But when you drain the cup to the dregs, God is waiting for you at the bottom. And I think that's definitely true for individuals. I know a lot of people went through the kind of Reddit atheist fedora wearing phase where, well, how can there be a soul if it's nowhere in the body and you can dissect the brain, etc. And then gradually you realize, well, wait a second, the hard problem of consciousness actually still exists, and neuroscientists are very perplexed. But so there's the individual kind of lifespan of that experience. But I also think that as a civilization, we've been going through that experience where we took that first sip from the cup of science in the time when we think of as the scientific revolution, especially Isaac Newton, who was not an atheist, and many of these early scientists were passionate believers in God, actually. But the Newtonian revolution and the discovery of the scientific method and everything, all of the radical discoveries that followed, really did open up the door to people saying, this is a clockwork universe, right? It's a machine. It runs on its own steam. And for a while, it's like around about the 18th and 19th centuries, it became more and more plausible to people that you don't need a god to explain the world. And there were people that really kind of pushed that line. But there were also sincere, I think, questioners, seekers who were troubled by these things. I mean, Darwin is a good example of somebody that, he wasn't scheming to cast God out from the world, but he was very troubled by what he saw as the truth. Now, especially in the wake of the quantum revolution, which is kind of what my book is about, but also in the wake of things like, the discovery of the Big Bang, which seems to be a beginning to the universe, in the wake of Einstein's physics, there are a lot of things now that actually don't make sense from a purely materialist standpoint. And really, that it never quite made sense all the way to explain things just as objects moving through space, because what sets them moving? There are all these unanswered questions, right? Why do they move? They're basic kind of common sense questions. Now, though, we're at a point where it really seems like our consciousness, that is the fact that you and I are not just meat puppets or meat machines, but have this living experience of the world, a qualitative experience of the world. That seems like a fundamental ingredient in existence. Yeah. It's not just kind of an accident, right? It's like this is part of what makes up the universe is this thing called consciousness. And once you're there, there's lots of things that might be going on, but materialism just ain't one of them. Like there is no room really anymore for a purely materialist look at the universe. And actually, the place I get to in the book is that one of the most accurate possible explanations for what's going on might be the one in the book of Genesis. Like this idea that there's a mind which speaks the world into existence and then creates other minds, namely ours, to kind of receive that message is actually a pretty plausible, scientifically plausible way of describing what's going on in the world. And I think you're starting to see it with all the people that are starting to convert, the Ion Hersey Alis of the world who are kind of waking up from what used to be the new atheism. We might be at the verge of a kind of new age.
It's just interesting to me how we got to this atheist moment, and people are, there was a moment in time, and maybe just where I was growing up in LA, where you would periodically sneeze and someone would yell science at you as opposed to God bless you, which is the God bless you thing is also pagan also, so I'm not into that. But the yelling science, like what is that about? And then you think about it, so my wife is a scientist of sorts. She's a medical doctor, and the more she learns about her field, which is oncology and hematology, I think the more she believes in God, because I think she sees, for every question she's answering, she's seeing several more that are unanswered. And I think she sees that sort of limitless progression as more evidence that science does not have all the answers and never will. And there is a components that we'll never fully understand in this life that are present even in the scientific setting. And so I do find it fascinating that a lot of people feel like, oh, well, we got science, so now we don't need God. No, sometimes it feels like we need God more.
Totally. That's funny about growing up and people saying science when you sneeze. That I never had that, but I had a very similar atmosphere. Like sometimes I think that this book is kind of written to me as a teenager in high school. I was not raised religious, and a lot of my friends, smart, kind of nerdy kids, basically, were just in an atmosphere where religion was something separate from the intellectual life. If you had it, that was fine, but it didn't really have any bearing on like the absolute truth, which was these kind of material facts. And that was the high noon of what we call the new atheism, right? That was when Christopher Hitchens was kind of the great. And he was a great writer, and he's sort of sorely missed now. But Dawkins and all these guys, many of whom are still around. At that time, it looked like they were it. They were kind of the way forward. We were all going to become more secular, more tolerant, more rational as science progressed. And I think in 2025, we can kind of gesture vaguely around and say, well, how's that going for us? There's a way in which that purely secular worldview totally failed to sustain civilization and revealed a lot of its emptiness in the COVID years, when it turns out science is often subject to these other authorities, and there are bigger questions that you have to ask before you start doing science. And if you don't ask and answer those questions theologically, you're going to end up asking and answering them politically, which is kind of what happened. We just bowed down to this political god during that era. And I think, people are starting to realize that science is, as you say, or as perhaps your wife is discovering, science takes place within a bigger structure.
Yeah,
always.
that's it.
Like, you're always asking, and the question is, what's that bigger structure gonna be? Is it gonna be politics, or is it gonna be God?
Yeah. So young people are not getting exposed to the classics, and I know you think about education a lot and are involved in it. And are young people getting encouraged to read these things, or now is basically the big fear that AI just summarizes it and that's going to be our relationship with it?
Yeah, well, I think both you are definitely seeing a lot of the really harmful effects of kind of not just AI, but social media use, right? This constant stream of stimulation that's taking people, and the fact that we've spent, my whole lifetime at least, like telling people that it's not worth reading the great texts, that'll do it too. So the general kind of landscape is pretty bleak for a bunch of reasons. But the other thing that's true, and this is kind of an economics point, is that like scarcity creates value. And so when the kind of old-fashioned experience of immersing yourself in great literature, when that is something kind of weird and unusual that most people aren't doing, when most people are kind of bathing their brains in gunk for 24 hours a day, suddenly somebody comes along and says, there's a better way. Like, you can actually log off for an hour a day and you can encounter the thoughts of a great soul. There's a kind of cachet and appeal to that. And I'm really noticing that in the classroom. Like, I taught one class on Marcus Aurelius once, and it was just a single book, the Meditations, that we were reading together for like 3 hours at each class period. And I had the phone chalice, this big kind of vase that I put in the middle of the table, and you had to turn your phone off and put the phone in the chalice, and there was no electronics. Everyone wrote by hand. We did kind of in-person essays and exams, etc. And I thought they were going to fight me on this kind of a lot. But in fact, not only did nobody fight me, but at the end I said, what was that like for you? And they were like, it was such a relief.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for somebody to tell me, put that damn thing down. I need a kind of authority to help me, because everybody does when they're growing up. So this is just to say, I think we are also seeing a real hunger and an awareness of that hunger for like analog life and for substantive, meaningful things to engage with that aren't videos of cats or
Sure.
whatever. So it's a rough time, but also there's a lot of opportunity in it.
Yeah, I'm noticing something just in my personal relationship with social media, which I've always been a skeptic. I was the first person, I was the last person I knew to join Facebook because that was the hottest platform when I was at my age. And then I was the first person to quit. I think I quit completely like 10 years ago. And I have people post on my behalf, but I can't do it. I never liked the energy that it gave me. I thought it made me very upset. But Twitter and Instagram I still participate in some of those because they're part of it. They're somewhat addictive. And I think that for younger people that have less stuff to do, I've got a bunch of jobs and children and a spouse I like, so I don't need it that much. But for some people, you can really see how this can replace your entire existence. And what I'm nervous about when it comes to reading in particular and books, which I write books and I value books and I read books. And one of the edges that I have, Spencer, and I'm sure you'll feel this way as well, is I think it's a huge edge that you read. And I think a lot of the people who do distinguish themselves are readers. I know Charlie Kirk, who has been the topic of conversation constantly throughout the last month. He was a voracious consumer of information. He was a big social media guy too. But he was always doing the Hillsdale College courses, and he took deep interest in books and literature as well, and just trying to understand some of the great thinkers, their best works. I think that's important. And I feel like that our brains, though, can we even handle it? That's what I'm concerned about, is that are we even going to be able to sit there and focus for an hour or 2 or 3 on something that's worth it?
It's funny about Charlie Kirk. You mentioned that you like to read people's books in full before you do an interview with them about the book. And not everyone may realize how rare that is. In fact, most book interviews you go on, and it's like
they barely know. They've read one page of a summary.
Right. So when Charlie Kirk was shot, I got a lot of texts like, "Did you know him? What was your experience like with him?" And that was the occasion for me to remember that I went on his show when I did my first book, How to Save the West, and was kind of taken aback from the jump of the interview when it was really clear he had read that thing back to front and in detail. Like, he had very specific questions, and he was like that. You know, when I started telling the story, people said, "Yeah, he read all the time," and it's a huge leg up, a huge advantage. The people who are best at using new technology are always the people who knew how to get on without it. Right? Wow. It's not just that you're better at reading books or sustaining attention. It's that you're better on social media. You're better at using AI because you have a kind of outside sense of what this tech can do, what its limitations are. And so this is something I always tell my students is like, I'm not just trying to get you to stop using Grok to summarize stuff. I'm trying to make you better at using Grok when you do use it because you have a sense of what the alternatives are. So yes, it's a huge advantage, but you say, well, how do we retain that ability when the other thing is so easy and so tempting? This is an ancient ethical problem, I think, called habituation. And that book, Atomic Habits, which I was kind of casting shade on this kind of book earlier, but one of the powerful insights in that book is that actually the vast majority of our character is our habits. Yes, we have these moments of individual choice, and our choices create our habits. But if you think about, like, what's that person like, you're mostly describing a bundle of habits. And those habits are formed, especially in youth, but always every day. We're always making choices to shape ourselves. And in fact, Aristotle, who was really, I think, the forefather of ethics as a science or as a really rigorous philosophy, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that the Greek word for ethics is related to the Greek word for habit, that they're almost one and the same thing. And that is kind of, I think, something we don't pay a lot of attention to, but it's something we know in education. The key to habits, I think, is that when you're young, they just have to be drilled into you. Mm-hmm. Like, we have this idea that it's bad to force somebody to memorize Latin verbs or to force them to practice basic good habits, you know. But actually, that's the core of education. And I think when my students said I was so glad to put my phone away, it's like, yeah, they were looking for somebody to force them to train in good habits so that then when you take the training wheels off, it becomes automatic. It becomes, and this is the classical term for it, a second nature, right? And so, yeah, we're constantly being assaulted with temptations to form bad habits, which just means that our efforts have to all be about, for ourselves and also for kind of the younger people in our care, our efforts are all about how do you establish and instill those good habits so that you can have a strong place to stand when you engage with the tech and when you go online and do so.
You know, I like this point because I want to ask you, if people are hearing this conversation, they want to get back into reading some things that are substantial. My instinct is to ask you, well, what should they read? And I'm going to ask you that. But more I want to ask about what's your habits like, because I actually had this conversation with your dad probably a decade ago, maybe longer, where I kind of asked about what his routine is, and people know Andrew as a podcaster now, but I think he thinks of himself probably first and foremost as an author and a writer. And I asked him about what the routine's like, and it seemed pretty rigorous. That he would have in his house a little I don't know, a casita, whatever you'd call it, a pool house, and it seemed like he'd go in there and he'd dedicate the whole day to reading and writing, and that's how to do it. But what do you recommend to people who they want to get in the routine of reading and writing too is very important as well. But what do you recommend for people to just get in a rhythm?
Yeah, well, the first thing I always say is taste and see. You got to force yourself at first to experience the good stuff until it becomes an acquired taste. And that does take time, but it takes less time probably than you think. I always prescribe 30 minutes a day of reading, 30 minutes of prayer, and 30 minutes of exercise. And that's an hour and a half of your day every day. And if you can do that, I think take a week of that and call me in the morning. Right? Do that for a week and see afterwards whether you want more. Because another ancient thing is we are three things, right? We are a mind, a soul, and a body. And there's all sorts of different versions of this, but from the Greeks to the Christians to kind of every great witness has this tripartite idea of the human. And I think if you really feed those three parts of yourself every day, you start to discover that actually you like this. There was a study that came out recently that since 2022, quietly, unbeknownst to a lot of people, social media use has actually been going down. It peaked in 2022, and people have been logging off more and more. And I think that's because like people actually do get tired of doing things that suck. Like hurting yourself hurts, and of course you can get addicted, and of course all of that stuff is true, and sometimes you need to like break yourself out of that cycle. But the advantage you have when you're doing good stuff is that it's good, and actually you will find that there's something deep in you that is satisfied by this. So yeah, I always say like it doesn't really matter that much what you pick to read. I recommend short stories, and I have a list of short stories on the New Jerusalem.
Great.
.substack.com that people can start out with because they're short, obviously, and they deliver a lot in a little space. And then you can start with the 4 canonical dialogues of Socrates' death, which are also quite short: the Crito, the Phaedo, the Apology, and the Euthyphro. And I said those out of order, but they're called the first tetralogy or the Socratic tetralogy. And they tell the story of Socrates' trial and death. Or you can start with the Gospels, which are profound texts and things that you need to understand, of which there are also 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the main thing is actually not, how many books have I finished this year? The main thing is, did I spend that 30 minutes every day, phone away, no other distractions, just reading? Because eventually you're actually going to want to spend more than 30 minutes. But you got to establish the rule first before the love kind of takes over, I think.
That's fantastic. Great recommendations. And I want to talk in general. This is the last topic for the day, Spencer. We could do this again if you'd like, because it's been enjoyable for me. Yeah. I want to talk about some of I do think there is a war of just on tradition, on classical thinking, on a lot of Western symbols, and I think this is all part of it. I think there's a design here. It's not just we're addicted to social media and we would prefer to have things summarized than doing the hard work of actually reading and sitting and contemplating and being left alone with our own thoughts. I think there's something broader. I think you see this with some of the attacks that we've seen on, recently we saw a pro-Palestinian protester defacing a statue of Pope John Paul II, calling him a fascist. It just feels like it's all wrapped up in the same stuff we're talking about. I imagine this is something you've thought about. Well, what do you think?
Well, I will say this. In 2020, so the summer of our discontent, the kind of torrid George Floyd maximalism that was running through the country, Princeton University's classics department put out a statement, that, a lot like a lot of others that were coming out at the time, saying classics has been a vehicle for all sorts of destructive, hateful ideologies, and we need to cleanse ourselves of this attachment, this connection between the discipline of Greek and Latin literature and fascism, basically. In 2021, ostensibly unrelatedly, Princeton dropped the requirement for classic students to learn Greek and Latin. And you no longer have to learn Greek or Latin to become a classicist. My suggestion here is that these two things are directly related to one another because language is a vehicle for culture. And if your culture is evil, if you believe that there is something dark and destructive about Western civilization more generally, then why should you bother to preserve or connect with or engage with the medium of this culture, which is the language and the literature of not only the Greeks and the Romans, but also the Jews and the Christians, and then the European nations that helped form what we call the West. Absolutely, these two things are connected and intentional and related. We could kind of digress at length about all the, cultural Marxists who sort of outlined the plan of attack here, guys like Gramsci and Noah Ignatieff, and there's a whole intellectual lineage, whatever. But the main point is, yes, it's not just a technological transition that is making it harder to read great works. It's also an ideological platform that people are advancing at using that technology. And usually it's presented as the way forward into some bright new future. But one of the things you learn from studying history is we actually only have the heritage that we've got. And yes, it's complicated. And yes, there are good and bad people and things and events in it. But the fundamental question is it good that Western civilization exists or not? And I think if you look at some of the alternatives in the ancient and modern world to Western civilization, you will discover that question has only one answer, and it's a resounding yes, it is good for the West to be. And in order for it to be, we got to preserve and maintain a connection to the sources of it.
Well done. All right, Spencer Klavan, the New Jerusalem Substack, you get that there. Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith, which I'm committed to reading this one, and then I'll have you back and we can talk about it. And anything else you're doing you'd like to alert the audience to?
Thanks for asking. Those are the main places. But also, as you mentioned, I'm an editor at the Claremont Review of Books, which has just come out with a new issue. I've got an essay in there about the great Latin poet Horace. So if you'd like to learn about that and much more, ClaremontReviewBooks.com.
All right, I'm gonna take the temptation. Is it a lonely world being the most literate 34-year-old around? I mean, there's not, because I'm pretty literate.
I wouldn't know.
You're bench pressing me right now, so I'm just curious.
No, I you'll have to ask the most literate 34-year-old. No, it's actually not lonely at all. It's incredibly. I feel like you're a part of this great secret society that stretches throughout time and space, right? I've got more friends. I've got this enormous kind of company of witnesses around me all the time of great minds. So I don't know. I think if you want more friends, read great books.
Very nice. Well said. I'm glad I asked that. All right, Spencer. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you being here today. And we'll
Thanks,
talk
Alex.
to you next time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
He's editor-in-chief of Breitbart News and a New York Times best-selling author. And on this podcast, he brings deep research, prescient analysis, and world-class guests. He's Alex Marlow, and this is The Alex Marlow Show.